Welcome back, Matishka.
Thanks for having me.
I feel like it's been too long.
It does feel like it's been too long, but I don't think it's been that long. I think
I
we just
know,
got
it feels so long. Huh? So what are we talking about today?
we're talking about monasticism, Orthodox
And marriage.
monasticism.
Okay, great. So monasticism and marriage. I think this is going to be a great one. So let's start with like, what is monasticism? I think a lot of people probably aren't too familiar with it. Maybe they know about it, but have never, been around monks or nuns, been to a monastery. So maybe you could
Yeah,
start there.
yeah. I think it's an easy thing to be misunderstood if we don't have firsthand experience of it. Especially if, like me, you grew up Roman Catholic, and I had a lot of exposure to Roman Catholic monasticism because my great aunt was a nun. We had multiple monastics in our family and priests and stuff. And I actually, as a child, used to frequently go to my great aunt's convent, which was in the city. Sadly, it's been actually torn down, which is wild. Anyway,
Yeah.
it was a beautiful place, beautiful architecture, and even the chapel that they had built when I was a teenager and sort of thinking about monasticism myself. I had stayed there and I read, they had given me like this book about the history of the convent. And in the book, I'll never forget this, it said that the abbess of this Roman Catholic monastery had all of the pieces of wood that were used within the church painted on all sides so that it would be a gift for God inside and out. So even the parts of the wood that weren't going to be facing. And that always stuck with me, just such a beautiful sentiment. But that monastic order, that convent, they all worked secularly. So sometimes that's our perception of monasticism is, basically like social workers, which St. Paisius, the Athonite specifically, actually writes an article to dispel that, to dispel the idea that monastics should be social workers, because St. Basil the Great had, I think they call them basilica or something like that, these like social institutions that would help people, help the impoverished, different things. But that's actually very different from monasticism. So monasticism, which is actually described pretty kind of a good insight into monasticism, is described in the book of Acts, when the early Christian communities held all things in common. And there's that famous story about the couple who withheld some of their money, that they gave some, and then, St. Peter was there, and the man dropped dead first, and then the woman dropped dead. So if you want to know a little bit about that, about like the holding all things in common, it's described there in the book of Acts. So the monastic life essentially is the life of virginity, the life that Christ lived, the life that we saw with St. John the Baptist, in a certain sense, where, he dwelt in the desert and he lived in poverty, and he just sought the will of God. So it's hard in a certain way to define it precisely, because in a certain way, monasticism it's a way of life, and it's a way of this individual, this monk, which in the Greek word monachos means like alone, like, but yet you most often see the most common monasticism, we call it cenobitic. And that's when they live together in community. So like you're both alone, but in community. And this is there's different types of monasticism, anchorite, idiorhythmic, but cenobitic is like the most, basically the most like what we saw in the community in the Acts of the Apostles, where the monks and nuns, they, as an individual person, are striving internally for their own salvation, but externally they live in a community where they do handicrafts and they do different things. But I think honestly, the best way to describe what monasticism is what St. Paisius himself describes. So the article that he had written is called The Monk's Mission. And it was specifically because certain time period in Greece, a lot of priests and even bishops were fighting against monasticism. And they were basically saying the monks and nuns, they should come into the world and they should do social work, like I had mentioned. So St. Paisius, though, wrote this article to describe, like, let me explain to you what the true life of a monk is. And he explains that monastics, so nuns and monks, so just for everyone to know, like if you are a nun, If you're a female, you would go to a women's monastery. If you're a male, you go to a men's monastery. So there's not communities that are like mixed. You might have communities that are close by one another, but the actual community would be for men and for women. So St. Pisces says monks are the radio operators of the church. And sometimes people can look at a radio operator in the military and say, come on, grab your rifle and join us. And St. Pisces explains that, well, no, being a radio operator is something different than just being one extra rifle in a platoon of 200 rifles. So he explains that a radio operator works like continuously to make contact, right? He's calling out on the radio to let the wider military know we need backup, we need reinforcements. And when he finally gets through, St. Pisces says, even if people mock him, even if they ridicule him and say, you're wasting your breath, still he struggles and struggles. He gets a hold of headquarters, then the Air Forces arrive, the Navy arrives, the Armed Forces, the backup arrives. So he says, in this way, and not with their meager rifles, the unit is saved. The same applies to the monk who advances with divine power with their prayer and not with a negligible individual power. So in other words, monastics are those who pray for the world and pray for their own salvation and seek their salvation, not unlike Christians in the world. Saint John Chrysostom actually says, you greatly delude yourself in error if you think that one life is commanded for the monastic and another for a layman. All must live this lifestyle. And he actually says what has turned the world upside down is that you think that one life is for the monastic and the other for a lay person, and it's not. The gospel was written for everyone. However, a monastic's going to do it even more intensely because they are going to live in virginity, so that without marital relations, with in obedience, with humility, and the kinds of unpossessiveness, basically poverty, that they give up their personal belongings in order to practice what is it called, unquisitiveness or something like that, basically like poverty. Anyway, so that's sort of like top of the trees definition of monasticism.
I love that by St. Paisios, by the way, because he was an actual radio operator in the war. That was his job. So he was speaking from his own experience there, but such a wonderful image to help us understand the importance of monastics in the world. Because, if you're in the world and you're kind of in the trenches of, whether it's fighting heresy or helping the church to grow, if you didn't have a proper understanding of monasticism, I can understand why you might think, well, they're just over there being selfish with their time, but nothing could be farther from the truth. They're actually praying for all of us in the world. And we think that matters, we think that that's actually something.
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of misconceptions to the perception of like, they're just rejects. They're like in Greece, this is a common misconception is like, oh, they, had unrequited love and that drove them to the monastery, and like they're sort of outcasts as people. They're not able to adapt and to like be among those in the world. Like monastics are the most social people. They have to be in order to be able to live in community. So I remember even being at a monastery once, and there was a young girl visiting, and she was thinking about whether or not to become a monastic. And it got me chatting with one of the nuns. And I said, I have a friend of mine who you could clearly see, like we would visit a monastery together and it'd be like pulling teeth to try to get her to leave. You knew that like she really just wanted to stay, and we would sort of tease her and be like, okay, well, we're leaving. You can stay if you want to. And she's like, okay, then go. I'll stay then. So you kind of knew like there was something there. And I remember talking to the nun about it, and I said, she thinks, this friend of mine, she's not sure that she can handle the monastic life. And I said, of course you can. You live in a 2-bedroom apartment with your whole family, and you share a room with like your 3 sisters. And the nun was like, no, Constantina, that's not it. That's not like, that has nothing to do with it. There's so much more to the calling of being a monk or a nun than just like, can you live with a bunch of siblings? There is more to it, but that is definitely a component of it. That being able to get along with others, being able to just live in a family environment where you're not constantly holding stuff against people, like it doesn't work. Just like a family environment won't work if you're constantly, there's not going to be peace in the family, right? So it's the same sort of thing with monastics. They have to be able to be social, but while at the same time, this idea that I seek my salvation out as an individual person. No one else can save me. Just being a monk or a nun isn't going to save me. But at the same time, I do it because I have this undeniable zeal and desire to wholly dedicate myself to Christ. It's not that people in the world don't dedicate themselves to Christ. God forbid that we would think that way. But it's that monasticism rejects any kind of compromise and seeks this absolute life, this absolute, applying the precepts.
Right. And St. Paisios, actually, to go back to what you said a little while ago about thinking that the monastery is for rejects, St. Paisios also talks about this in one of his books. I don't remember which one, but he makes some kind of statement of, and he's referring to people in Greece, but the people just want to give their daughters who, maybe their, leg is, malformed or something, and they have the mindset that, oh, they're not worthy of the world, or, they're kind of the rejects, right? And so we can give them to the monastery, but we're going to save, the good ones, the whole ones, the smart ones, the beautiful ones for the world. And he said, if people would think differently, if you give, your best in terms of, not that some children are better than others. That's not what the saint is saying, but you offer to God the best of what you have, then He's going to bless that. He's like, our whole country would change if people would change their way of thinking on this. And then Metropolitan Athanasios of Limassol actually had a little beautiful article on communication in marriage and the importance of talking to each other. And he actually talks about monastic life being the same in this. If I can read this little section. We also learn to communicate with others in the monastery with the help of obedience, humility, and asking forgiveness, understanding that it was you that made a mistake, not the other person. Maybe you outwardly have a right to something. I spoke with my elder about this many times, and he would answer, if I were to judge, I would tell you, you have the right. But you don't have the right, even if you have the right to it, because you're not looking at things in a spiritual way. And he goes on to talk about how this is the exact same thing, whether you're in a marriage or in a monastic setting, right? It's to live the Christian life, which you alluded to earlier.
Yeah, exactly. Really, the main difference is, and we can talk a little bit more about that, is like obviously the life of virginity and the life of no possessions. Those are the really main things that in monasticism they would have, and in the married life and the life in the world, we own possessions and we don't necessarily practice virginity. But even that, like, I think that's also a misconception. You hear a lot of people, not a lot, but you hear a good amount of people who think that, Adam and Eve, they were created and like right from the hop, they were having relations. And that's not true. That is not even what the church has ever taught. The church teaches that Adam and Eve lived together in paradise in virginity. St. John Chrysostom talks about this, that celibacy existed in the beginning. He says at the outset, so when he talks about the book of Genesis, at the outset and from the beginning, the practice of virginity was enforced. However, when due to their indifference, they disobeyed and sin began, that lifestyle was taken away. So that life of virginity was our originally intended way of life. Yes, Adam and Eve were created male and female, and they would have had fruit. They would have had children essentially, but it would have come about probably in a different way than what happens not probably, that is what the fathers teach, that virginity was the way of their life. And then after the fact, then that's how marital relations gets introduced after the fall, after they're expelled from paradise. And so with all that Old Testament, you have all of these people who have righteous marriages, some unrighteous marriage, some unions that aren't righteous, all these things with marital relations, essentially, whether in marriage or outside of marriage, that those acts. But with Christianity comes about this life again, this renewed life of paradise that people are seeking. And so you have people even as early as St. Justin Martyr, 2nd century, describing that Christians, some would choose to live, he says something like they contract marriages only for the sake of raising children, right? So they get married, but then this is a very common, not so much today, but it was a very common practice historically, that after the couple had had children, they would no longer have marital relations. They would actually live as brother and sister. So he talks about this, and St. Justin says, and then there are those who choose completely to remain basically without any relationships whatsoever. In other words, monastics.
Mm-hmm.
And so
in recent history, married couples would do that when they got older, not hundreds and hundreds, but recent
history. Not obviously, probably in the last, maybe since the sexual revolution, we've started to see this fall off as a common practice, but certainly was very predominant practice. And still is, I'm sure, today to some degree, right? To some degree, people choose to live that kind of lifestyle. And certainly in the lives of the saints, we see these kinds of things. Saint and the practice of actually leaving and becoming monastics. But that, maybe we'll talk about that maybe a little bit later, where I know many people who were married and in the end of their life actually ended up becoming monastics. So very not uncommon at all. St. Andronicus and Athanasia, who will celebrate on October 9th, this is what they did after their children were raised. This is how they actually left and became monastics. So Amma Simbaktiki, she was a desert mother. She was basically like the St. Anthony's for women and for men, really, because her actual life was written by St. Athanasius the Great, who was the deacon at the first council, and the disciple of St. Anthony the Great, who defended Christ and wrote, on the Incarnation, is like one of his main works that we have. So something that she said that I think really kind of hits home, like it's very difficult for us being from democratic societies. I think my brother used to say this, and I think he was dead right about it. We don't like, I don't know if anyone, I'll just say it. I don't know if anyone's read Tocqueville's Democracy in America. Okay, but this is like a very, very thick political philosophy work. And he talks about this, like basically what you're going to have in America is everybone's going to be C. Instead of being people striving to be A pluses, you're just going to have basically everybody just become C's. Like, no one's going to very much excel. No one's going to like fail very greatly, but just everybody will be moderate. I think in this democratic society where we see, all of us are equal, there's no like the king and the royal family, and they're so much higher than us, right? Everybody's equal. And I think that this sentiment also pervades our thoughts when it comes to monasticism. We don't like the idea that there is a class of, a group that are more elites than we are, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that can partly be why you have people kind of rail against monasticism. Mm-hmm. It's a form of jealousy. They don't want to believe that there's someone more elite than them, that there's a group above them, of course, the irony is monastics themselves know it's not me as an individual. It's the angelic life as a lifestyle, as this dedicated, wholly dedicated life to Christ. Everyone knows the person who trains every day for the marathon is going to be way more fit than the person who just occasionally exercises. Mm-hmm. And that's what monastics are. They're wholly dedicated every day training for the spiritual marathon. So Amma Simbaktiki describes this by interpreting a gospel passage. And she says, you are not ignorant of the gospel parable concerning the 100, the 60, and the 30. The 100 symbolizes our own calling, in other words, monastics. The 60, the rank of those who practice continence or self-control in the world, in other words, live without relations in the world. And the 30 are those who live prudently in the married state. Now, it is good for us to pass from the 30 to the 60 because it is good for one to advance from the lesser to the greater, whereas it's hazardous to fall from the greater to the lesser. So it's not saying 30 isn't bad, but right, that's the gospel where it talks about you reap some 30-fold, some 60-fold, some 100-fold. The monastics reap the 100. Those who practice virginity will reap 60. And those who practice the married life, but not just the married life. She says a very specific thing. who live prudently in the married life, these will be the 30-fold, because fortunately we see not all of us live, even the married state, we don't live it according to our traditions and according to the way that, the church has always lived. So like you have Saint, if you just picture it this way, like you have like Saints Andronicus and Athanasius, okay, they lived together, they raised their children, then they become monastics. Then you have a little bit higher than that is like, well, I don't know, can you say higher, just different. You have someone like Saint Galactian and Episteme. They get married, he convinces her to become a Christian, then he convinces her not to even live as married husband and wife. They immediately become monastics. That's very unique. And it's also, I mean, it's not something we would necessarily recommend. Like if you want to be a monastic, go be a monastic. Do you know what I mean? Don't like raise someone and then try to convince them unless circumstances change. Like maybe you find out you can't have children, or maybe, I don't know, whatever the circumstances might be, we allow for.
Forgive me, this is probably a good point to say we're not talking pastorally here, or we're just talking about what the church teaches about things.
Exactly.
Everyone
And examples from the lives of the different ways that this life is lived. But then you have people like St. John of Kronstadt who continue to live in the world, right? So he was a pastor, and in his case, it was very unique. He didn't tell his wife ahead of time. They got married, and then he told her, similar to St. Galactian. Then he told her, actually, I think we shouldn't have relations and we should live as brother and sister. So she actually wasn't okay with that. Her father was also a priest. She ended up or I don't know if she personally or how it came about, but it was sort of reported back to church officials, like the bishop, like this is what he's proposing, which is an anomaly. It is an anomaly from the wedding, you know what I mean? To say we're not going to live as a married couple. And it was funny because I was trying to track down, I had heard this description of how the bishop got convinced that he would allow it. He would like not basically cause problems for St. John, and who wanted to live this lifestyle with his wife. So I was trying to track down the source for it because I thought it might be in one of his books, but Father John reminded me, years ago when we used to live in Korea, we frequently listened to this radio station from Russia, and it was called Voice of Russia, and it would tell all these amazing stories about a Christian message from Moscow. That's what it was. And it was like that was the program we would listen to. And it was on that program, I think, where I told the story that the bishop had sort of said to him, like, you can't do this. This is inappropriate. Was sort of starting to push back against St. John. And I don't remember exactly the details, but his medallion that the bishops wear, and they call it, even in Russian, they call it the Panagia, because it's an icon of the Mother of God in Christ. It fell off his neck on its own accord. And he was enlightened to know, like, I can't fight against this. This is God's will for this couple, and I need to let it be. And so his wife, St. John of Kronstadt's wife, kind of came around, and she agreed to live that lifestyle with him. Again, pretty unique, not as common as like a couple who would raise their children and then live that way. But then you have couples who live the married life and adhere to the church's tradition and practice abstinence when it's appropriate to practice abstinence. So not all the time, but one of the things that we see in our world is, I remember being at a monastery, and there was a family there. There was a couple families, some things that occurred, and a number of the children in these families were very unwell. And I remember sitting with the abbess and asking her, not exactly what causes them to be ill, but what's the spiritual situation and such that we see such prevalent illness in our children today? There has to be more than just, I don't know, just unhealthy, physically unhealthy. There must be more to it than that. And she said to me, a big part of it is because couples know, she said, couples used to know to be careful, but people don't know that anymore. And so you don't have couples, for example, abstaining on fast days, abstaining on feast days. Couples don't know to do that. Or if they know, they struggle with it and they make mistakes. Struggling with something and making a mistake is actually very different than never practicing it at all. And that's, I think, what more we see in our world. And so that's the other component about this life, is like the married life needs to be lived. So that when they call it like a chaste marriage, they don't mean a couple that lives as brother and sister. They mean a couple who lives as a married couple, but is careful when they have marital relations. If they're going to commune, that they abstain from marital relations and certain fast days and certain feast days. So if we're unsure about what days we would abstain, it should be easy enough for us to find out, because the church only prescribes weddings for certain times. So if a wedding is allowed, marital relations are allowed. And if a wedding is not allowed to take place, the marital relations should also be abstained from. And this will actually help us to be more spiritually healthy and help our families to be more spiritually healthy. We can't say, I made this mistake and therefore this happened. Like, I'm not talking about that. That's for like an actual discerning spiritual father to determine. Mm-hmm. Or a bishop to determine. We're just saying, as a general rule, just as we abstain from certain foods during fast periods, we abstain from marital relations. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't know this. So again, it's not that we should not be mistaken to think that only monasticism is good and everything else is bad. And we shouldn't think that only the married life is good and everything else is bad. No. We are Christians and we believe monasticism is good for those who are called to monasticism. And the married life is good and blessed for those who are called to the married life. So that needs to be really clear from the get-go. Like, when we praise monasticism, it's not to denigrate marriage, but it's certainly to acknowledge that monasticism in the rightful order is above the married life. Mm-hmm. That's what St. Athanasius is saying here. That's what St. Athanasius, when he's recording her words, is knowing to be true and passing them along.
Matushka, you're saying too many good things. So I want to back up a little bit. Okay, slow down. I know we only have an hour today, so we're trying to pack this conversation. But St. Paisios, again, talks in great detail many times about the spiritual laws being in effect, like with what you're saying with sick children, for instance. And it's not only the issues of when marital relations are allowed and not allowed by the church, but also things that are never allowed in the church, right. in marital relations, unfortunately happening quite often. So all of these things, and there's a difference probably, I would think too, between people who truly don't know, which is a lot of people, and people who know and maybe scoff at it. Yep. And people, like you said, who know and are trying their best and are struggling to live by, the church's guidance and wisdom. And I would just want to go back to also this idea of we're, as Americans or North Americans, very uncomfortable with, classes of people, or saying that some things are better than others. We really, it's very humbling to think, okay, I'm if you think you're the top Orthodox Christian, you read the lives of the saints, and there's a book, Ascetics in the World. I'm sure you've read this or seen this book, and it's just normal kind of ascetical people, like we're talking about maybe years ago. Yeah, lay people. Yeah. And it will just put you to shame, the level of spirituality that these people had in very recent history, rivals the monks and nuns of today, honestly, in a lot of places. For sure. So, and so we have to be careful that we humble ourselves and say, yeah, this is a higher path. And I think I was chatting with somebody else, but I mentioned it to you earlier about, the other thing we can do is look at the lives of the saints. And if you look at the lives of married saints, you see a pattern. You see the pattern of they're either martyred, one sometimes by the other, spouse, or they go off and live in monasticism. I can't really think of any married couple who are maybe still living as a married couple that are saints. Can you?
It depends what you mean by living as a married couple.
I mean, having marital relations.
Yeah. The most that I know are ones who get martyred. A lot of people lost that. Where are the people in the world, the saints in the world? Well, there are some, and the thing is, we're not necessarily going to know the people in the world that are saints, right? We're just not necessarily, they're not going to be revealed to us maybe as much as the ascetic hermit who lives out in the wilderness that people go out to see.
I guess my point is that the church would show us if these things were truly on the same level as
exactly,
then we would see loads of saints who
Exactly.
are like, normal married couples.
It's certainly a higher life is the point, definitely. And
Right.
we want to aspire to that to whatever degree, like just like Saint Syncretiki said, we want to be 30 and go up to 60. We don't want to be a 100 and go down to 60 or to 30, to 30 especially. We don't pass judgment on those who leave the monastery. This is an unfortunate reality. It happens. People leave monasticism. Um, but we're just speaking generally about the monastic life. We're not even speaking necessarily about individual monastics, although when you have the opportunity to visit monasteries and to get to know individual monastics, you'll quickly see, even just like the regular monastic, like how, I don't know, like how much their thought has become like conformed to the mind of Christ. Like just in every like little action. Like I spent a significant amount of time with the women's monasteries when I lived in Greece, and it just prevails everything in a way that as a person from the world you just wouldn't necessarily anticipate. And it affects like, it's like every element of their life. Like really interesting things, like they'll sew like a small cross here, like on the edge of their clothing, so that at the hem of their garments, so that nothing evil can get, like no demons can cause problems. I remember being somewhere once at a monastery, and I don't think I was whistling but maybe I did whistle. I'm not a whistler, but somehow it came up anyway. One of the nuns had said to me, she used to whistle a lot, and then the nuns just said to her, like, venkani, which is just like in Greek, it's like, we don't do that. And I was like, what? Why? Like, I don't know. It seemed like a funny thing to me. Like, what's with whistling? And she said about it, like, it calling the demons. Now, I don't know where this came from. I'm sure there's people who, there's saints who maybe, I'm sure it comes from somewhere. But what I mean is just like, it just everything. When they make pasta, and they put the pasta sauce on the spaghetti, they put it in the form of the cross. Like there's nothing about their life that isn't wholly dedicated to Christ and to the gospel, and
Not in a compulsion kind of way.
not in the
And then
compulsion
like
at all. Exactly.
giving every moment to the God, in everything that they do.
Just like, yeah, in every way, that it's so within, like it's so forefront in their mind that they see it everywhere in order to practice it everywhere, and it's such a beautiful experience to get to go to a monastery and get to know a little bit the monastics. We can't always do that. I mean, where we live, we're very far from monasteries. We try still to go at least once a year, and Father John encourages our parishioners to go when they are traveling, when they're outside of the province, when they're in places that have monasteries. And one of the main reasons is because the monastery is a spiritual battleground. So on the one hand, it isn't a sanctuary in the sense of like, oh, you go, like the monastics go and they must be at peace all the time. Like, absolutely not. It is a full-on fight, spiritual fight at all times.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes as a layperson, you'll perceive that. But they are praying for the whole world. And so that sanctuary, like in that sense, it is an actual sanctuary. It is a lighthouse. Like their prayers, like Saint Solomon says, he says something like, prayer continues for the world, and that's why the world continues to exist. And when the righteous men and women, like when monastics, no longer pray for the world will cease. Like, this is how strong their prayers are. They are the radio operators. Now, we aren't, we don't necessarily have the spiritual perception to perceive it, but sometimes we do. And that's who these people are. Even when they're bad monks or bad nuns, like let's say, they're not a St. Paisius the Athonite. They struggle, they fall, they get up, they get cranky. They might say, they might get into fights. They might have a very difficult, nevrikos, irritable personality. All that stuff exists. And yet still their lifestyle that's dedicated to Christ, there's a grace that comes with that, and that actually influences the world for the better. And it's something that we in the world, like, we should call this to mind, because it's very encouraging for us to know there are people out there praying for me, for my family, for my province, for my state, for my country, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and because of their prayers, we're upheld. So we shouldn't think of it as like too bad, they're better than me and I'm upset about that, but rather like, thank God there are people out there, because if the world is dependent on me for prayer, and if the state of the world is dependent on my level of purification, it's not gonna, like, it's all gonna go to hell in a handbasket if it's dependent on me. But the monastics, see, because their whole life is dedicated to purification and illumination, that's why you have this, the grace that comes. And so that's something else to say, like, it's not just the life of virginity, it's not just the abstaining, right, of marital
Mm-hmm.
relations, it's actually the purification of the passions within the person. And that purification makes them vessels, that makes them worthy to be illumined, to have the Holy Spirit come and dwell in them, for them to experience union with God. And then that is what also influences the world and transforms those around them. So it's, we wouldn't want to I wouldn't want to give the misimpression that it's just about abstaining from relations.
Right.
Because as St. Basil the Great says, he says something like, I never laid with a woman my whole life, but I'm not a virgin. And what he means is, you can sin in your thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
And
we
even
just,
the demons fast, and these things,
yeah,
right? You say that
exactly.
they
The
have
demons
a sort of
from relation.
demonic
Yes,
asceticism. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. But monasticism is just, you know, it's like that saying St. John of the Ladder says, angels are a light for men,
Mm.
and men are a light, or what is it? Angels are a light for
For
men.
the monks.
Monks are, there we go. Angels are a light for monks. Monks are a light for men.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing, is like, we as people in the world, we look to them like as our big brothers and sisters, to be inspired by them, to feel uplifted by them, to feel supported by them. And so I think that's also why it's so important for us to be exposed to monasteries, and to expose our children to monasteries.
Mm.
So on that topic, I would like to turn the table here a little and ask you some questions, if that's
Oh
okay.
dear. Yes, but we also have to make sure we talk about marriage. But go ahead.
About marriage, let's talk about marriage.
Well, no, go ahead and ask. What is your question?
Well, okay, so in the context of marriage, in the context of the family life, why
Mm-hmm.
why would we think it's a good idea for the family to be exposed to monasticism, and for children particularly to be, why would we want them exposed to these old men and women who, long scraggly beards, sometimes in both cases, and long, unkept robes?
That's such a good question. We we live near a monastery now, but my kids are mostly grown. And but the monastery that we went to when they were younger was a very small kind of Russian style monastery. And I guess I would say I would want to take them so that they could see, or for several reasons, so they could see how wonderful the life was, like how much peace was there. Because I knew that I wasn't a good example of, especially, you know, as a young mom, I was always kind of frazzled, and I wanted them to see that people love Christ so much that they would live this way for Him. I also just wanted the nuns to know them so that they would pray for them more fervently, so that they would, have that relationship, so that, um, as your kids grow older, it's like I super value the people that poured Christian love and Christian faith into my children, because kids get to a point where they're less likely to listen to mom and dad, and the people who took an interest in, especially in my teenagers, I'm like eternally grateful for that. So monastics who, were willing to be their friend, and, that love, and to kind of reiterate and what I had tried to tell them, but, to tell them in an even better way. I felt like that was invaluable. So that would be my answer. I don't know if that's a good answer or not.
It is a good
But
answer.
to see people that, are really living the Christian life, that really love God, that um that you see that they live the gospel. There's one gospel for all of us, right? But they're living it in such an intense way that nothing else matters but, communing with God. It doesn't matter, if the little place we went to, it's very, very poor. It was just a little house in a very old neighborhood. And um, you could walk in and just think, well, this is like a junky little place. There's like the carpet's old and it's got like, you know, old toys that people left, but everything, they just took care of everything. Everything was done with such care. And they saved every little twisty tie on every little bread bag, like they were so poor, right? And they didn't have to live that way, right? But they chose to, right? Because they chose to, like you said, do everything with care, but with love of God. And it was just a absolutely beautiful thing to see. And they just shined, their countenances were just peaceful and full of joy and full of love. And even when things get difficult, or even when, like, I would say something really stupid and embarrassing, like they didn't react in a way that was like they didn't reject you. They still loved you. They wouldn't like kind of go along, but they'd be like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
yeah, like why wouldn't, like, these are the best people in the world. Why, I want my kids to be influenced by that. And I think that children are so pure when they're young that they get it. Like you don't even have to explain it to them; they just get it, and they love it. All the kids that I know who are exposed to monasteries really love it, almost across the board.
Yeah, it's really important for kids to have that exposure, and it's so hard to live in a place where you can't give that to people. Like I can't, like you have to have money to travel from here to get to a place. Like the nearest Kinnibitic monastery is like a 3.5 hour flight. And it's not even that far away for Canada, but it's that far. It is that far though.
Yeah.
And that kind of pains me because monasticism is so influential, but especially when we first became Orthodox, because we were around it so much more.
Mhm.
And it really helps us as Christians living in the world to like see things properly.
Yes.
And it's hard to like have that phronema, like that mindset, just like on your own. You know what I mean? It's certainly possible, like through prayer and especially through like praying to the saints and reading about the saints and reading good books. It's certainly possible to have that phronema, but there's something different when you just watch someone who
Mhm.
has it, the way that they speak, the way that they interact, the way that they go about their tasks, you know,
Mhm.
all of that just has such a strong impact and influence, especially on children, but on all of us, because
Mhm.
we learn by watching. You know what I mean? We learn by being, and but Dorotheus talks about that. He says that if you want to learn how to fear God, go and find an elder who fears him, and the fact that he fears God, he'll teach you to do likewise. It's just the way that the person is, right? So I put my trust in the fact that there's at least monastics praying for our community, for our little parish in this really isolated, geographically isolated place. But at the same time, knowing, like from my own experiences with the abbess in Greece, who said to me when we were going to leave, that there's no distance in the spiritual life. There is no barrier. There's no, St. Pisces and St. Porphyrius and St. Sophronia of Essex, they wanted to chat with each other. Maybe we talked about this another time, but they were like, oh, we have to schedule a phone call. And literally they just said their prayers. Like they said some prayers on their prayer rope, and they were
Mhm.
able to like communicate with one another, like a spiritual telephone. St. Porphyrius talked a lot about that, the spiritual telephone.
I know
So
Elder Ephraim said the same thing to one of the Yarandisas in America, that why did you come all the way to Arizona to see me? We're like spiritually connected all the time. You didn't have to come all this way.
yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Wow. But you had such an incredible experience, that I'm sure sustained you. I mean, just you know, the few times we try to go maybe once or twice a year to monasteries, but we weren't there very long, but just it doesn't take much to sustain you for so long, right? And so your experience, though, I know you're not in your monasteries now, that the beginning experience you had was, I can tell, so foundational in your own spiritual life.
Yes, absolutely. And it's also why I feel so not obligated exactly, but like I feel the weight of responsibility to try as much as I can to like distribute the blessings I got from being with the sisters, because like how can you receive so much and not, but giving it on, like passing it on, means you actually have to have had it, acquired it, and not just learned, in your mind, but have actually
Mhm.
acquired it. And that's the book, The Scent of Holiness, was because in my mind I was picturing we would go to church in Thessaloniki, especially where they just put like handfuls of incense, and like everything that you had on in church would smell of incense for so long afterwards, your hair,
Mhm.
everything. And it was like, that was what monasticism, that was what it was like to just be around the nuns. The scent of their holiness kind of could cling to you, to the extent that even when you walked away from that environment, it still felt like you could still smell it. It was still present for you.
Mhm.
And, that's like, married life is very beautiful. Family life is so beautiful. We see that all the time. And even that, we're always looking for like, people will say like good families. I want to, like, of course you do. You want to have companions in the world and friends in the world. But even better than that is for your children to know monastics who will pray for them, who they can look to for guidance, even if it's just without words, like they just knowing that that person is there praying for them will give the children, encouragement. But that's how great the monastic life is. So shall we share a little St. Constantine the Great's perspective on monasticism?
Yes, absolutely. This is such a great story.
So it's actually, I think it's pretty little known, but it's in the life of St. Pius the Great. So if anyone like reads the Synaxarion, it's probably not in like short versions that you may read
Mhm.
about him online, but on his feast day, it is in his Synaxarion. And there's an icon actually of St. Constantine appearing to St. Pius the Great. So St. Pius the Great was uh, uh, well-known monastic struggler. And one day he's praying and St. Constantine the Great appears to him. And his disciple actually like has come along at some point, the doors closed, and he's like, I could hear voices, but when I went in, Abba, there was no one there. And he explains to his disciple, the person who you heard me speaking with was my friend Constantine the Great, the first king of the Christians, who descended from heaven, being sent by God to tell me, blessed are you who have been made worthy of the monastic life, for truly unique is the godly blessing of the Savior towards you. I asked him, and who are you, my Lord, who are saying these things and magnifying us monks? And he replied, I am Constantine the Great, and I descended from the heavens that I might reveal to you the glory which monks receive in the heavens and the closeness and boldness which they have towards Christ. And I magnify you, O Paisius, for you guide them in this holy path of asceticism. I therefore blame and condemn myself for not being granted this greatest rank of monastic, and I cannot bear the loss which I experienced. And again I said, why, O wondrous one, do you judge yourself? Have you not received that eternal glory and divine illumination? Now, St. Constantine the Great is a huge saint. Whatever modern society tells you, the church has always held him as a great saint. And so St. Pius, of course, is like, what do you mean? You've attained this great glory in heaven. Have you not received that eternal glory and divine illumination? He replied to me, so St. Constantine replies, yes, I have received them, but I do not have the boldness of the monks, neither glory equal to theirs. For I saw the souls of some monks who have been separated from the body and flew as eagles, and with great daring rise to the heavens, and the rank of demons did not dare approach them at all. Then I saw that the gates of heaven were opened for them, and they entered in, and I appeared before the heavenly king. And they appeared before the heavenly king, standing with great boldness before the throne of God. For this reason, therefore, I am amazed by you, monks, and I bless you, and I condemn myself for not being made worthy of the boldness of this life. For I wish that I could have left my passing kingdom and the royal robe and crown, and to become poor, and to wear a sackcloth, and to accept all those things that the monastic life seeks. And again I said to him, you say this, O most holy king, and you console us with these words. However, this must be the judgment of God, and we are unable to say anything different regarding divine righteousness, for the righteous judge grants for each according to his worth in righteousness, and rewards for the works of everyone. For your unique life did not have the same struggles as the life of the monks, for you had a wife to help you, and your children and your servants, and different rewards and comforts. For the monks, disdaining all of the joys of this present life, receive God instead of the good things of the world, and bearing him with joy and special riches, and to be made pleasing to him, they consider him their food and their great reward. And they are, according to the apostle, destitute, afflicted, ill-treated. Therefore it is impossible, my king, for you to be equal to them. And at that point, therefore, you came, O my brother, and St. Constantine straightway ascended to the heaven. Therefore, now having learned this mystery that has occurred, how good must the pains of asceticism seem? Strengthen the brothers.
So good. And
Yes.
this is also, this idea that the kingdom of heaven, there's a hierarchy there as well, as we see, right? But that it's not the first time we've had saints come back and tell us, like, if I would have known, like with the Saint Paisius the Athonite and his encounter with Saint Euphemia, the great martyr, right? He asked her, how did you endure all these terrible sufferings? Because as she told him her sufferings that she endured, he saw them as in watching TV, he says, right? And so he says, how did you endure? And she says, if I would have known, like how wonderful heaven was for those, that give their life in martyrdom, I would have like done it, just over and over, right? Forever.
Yeah.
Because the reward is so great.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that the monastics embody so well, is that, we're all struggling to live a Christian life. We're all struggling to love God and our neighbor, the people in our lives. But we sometimes forget, like, there isn't a reward at the end of our life. Like, the end of our life is just the beginning of the next life. And the monks and the nuns live that out. They understand that. They're okay taking the loss. They're okay taking the slander because they know, that one priest said to me, you should help with this project because, it'll be another jewel in your crown, right? They have that. It's okay if I don't get paid in this life. I don't actually want to get paid in this life. I want to be paid in the next life. And it shows such a confidence in the next life, that we don't just say we believe it. No, we live our life now in a way that shows we believe it.
And it's also what's not okay. Like, obviously St. Constantine contrasted for us how much higher the monastic life is than the married life. But and he talks about how that was what was said. You had a wife to comfort you. You had children. You have these things in the world. But by looking at monasticism, we should also learn a thing or two about how we live as married couples. Like you had mentioned earlier with, Metropolitan Athanasius in his description, because we should approach marriage like you would a monastery, in the sense of like this person is my co-struggler. Mm-hmm. They're not there to adore me and to fulfill my every need to be loved and doted on. They are there to push me and to help me up when I fall, and to push me when I am needing to be pushed forward. That's what our spouse is supposed to be like. That's what we are supposed to be like for our spouse. That's what a Christian marriage is. And that's also what we see in monasticism. Monastics would make the best spouses. That's who monastics are. They're not the rejects. They're the people who would make the best spouses. So when we as a married couple, we look to them as an example. We look at their forbearance. We look at their endurance. We look at their patience, all of those things. They live in community just like we live in community with our spouse. Who marries a person who has the exact same personality as them? Very few people have a spouse who has the same. No, you have like different, you might think alike or you might be alike in certain ways, but you have different pressure points, different things that frustrate you, and the whole purpose of our Christian life is for us to be pushed and pulled with one another, so that we actually become more refined, become more purified, and have, our heart and mind be in a better position to receive the grace of God. That's what married life is. It's that instead of the monachos, who is alone, who at the end of the day, though he or she lives in community, at the end of the day, he goes to his cell by himself. The difference is in married life, you always have that companion. So you want to be a worthy Christian companion for your spouse, and we want to choose worthy Christian companions. And when we maybe find ourselves in a situation where we are having a hard time with our spouse, there could be any number of reasons. It could be people change. It could be, I became a Christian and they haven't become a Christian. Any number of situations can happen. And yet still we want to persevere and to show endurance and to show, if St. Euphemia says, I would suffer 1,000,000 times for Christ. If I had known the glory that I would have received in heaven, I would have suffered 1,000,000 times over. We want to have that same mindset within the married life, within the family life. If I knew how much glory God would give me for being patient with my children, for, caring about them, even when maybe they've kind of turned against me, or, whatever the situation is, all of that same stuff we're talking about St. Euphemia, about the way that the monastic views their struggle, it's the same for us. It's just in a little bit of a different context. And that's why we want to be exposed to monasticism. We want to be exposed to the lives of the saints, because these people struggle so well. We want to take what we can learn from them. It's like going to an amazing personal trainer who has done it all, who has been through it all, who knows what you need to do in order to perfect this or that thing, or overcome this or that weakness. That's what we want in order to apply it to our lives. It isn't good enough, let's say, to just make a pilgrimage and it just be what it is at the monastery. We want to apply these things to our own life, so that we become the kinds of spouses, the kinds of mothers, the kinds of fathers that actually inspire our family to struggle more, to fast a little bit extra, to deny themselves a little bit more, to be a little bit more charitable, to give a little bit more alms. This is actually the people we want to become, so that without, causing problems, without coercion, without any of that stuff, we become the kind of light that just actually sheds light. Like, that's what it is to acquire Christ, to become like him, and then to inspire other people to be like him.
Yeah, I'm so glad you're taking it right where I wanted to go, because I know we only have a few minutes left, but I really want to end. Well, I mean, a few minutes, it's like the Vespers, right?
For us is
let us complete our evening prayer to the Lord, and we go on for another half hour. That's what I mean. So we're closing in. But I really want to end on this idea of what is the purpose of marriage, because as I've shared with you privately, and I have to admit I'm a little nervous about saying this publicly, but I think it's a real problem that we make family life into an idol. I'm sorry, I just have to say that. Like, I loved being a mother of 4 kids. I absolutely loved staying at home with my children. It was like the golden years of my life. I can honestly say that. But it is not the purpose of marriage. So we have to be like super clear about that, because I think when you make the children or the homeschooling or whatever it is, your perfect relationship, romantic relationship with your husband, the purpose of your marriage, things become disordered, right? And so what is the proper order? You should love your children. You should give your life for them. You should give your life for your husband and love him. But let's talk about what is the actual purpose of marriage?
Yeah, to become saints, to become holy. Like, that's the whole purpose of our whole life. So if that's the purpose of our life, that's the purpose of our every context, the way we live our life. The purpose of marriage is to become holy. Like, what does that mean? What does that look like? Well, it looks all sorts of ways for different people, because it depends so much on the context. But it certainly isn't to focus so much on our family that we forget our prayers. Like that's important for us to know.
Mm-hmm.
For us not to supplant our daily prayers. Now, sometimes we don't have the ability. It's like when we're sick, for example, right? We don't have the actual ability. That's okay. With consultation with our spiritual father, those things can be adjusted. But for us to never forget that. Who says it? St. Nicodemus, the Athonite, I think, says, the primary vocation of the Christian life, that's it, to love Christ. Like, the primary vocation, whatever you are, whatever your context, is to love Christ, is to seek to acquire his grace. And so we really need to be like, especially when I think families, when it's like really busy, when there's a lot of kids, there's a lot of going on, it's really hard to have that time to like step back, to have that self evaluation, to have times to like do prayers with a quiet mind. But as St. Pisces has said in other contexts, is where there's a will, there's a way. So we have to figure out what works for us, but to never forget for 1 second that the primary vocation of my life as a mother, as a wife, as a worker, whatever it is, as a monk, as a nun, is to love Christ first and foremost, then to fulfill my obligation as a wife, as a mother, as a worker, etc. So of course, it's not easy to be like, map it out. Here's exactly how we need to live our life because it's so circumstantial. Like some people have sick children. Some people themselves are sick, and that's a big cross. St. Pisces talks a lot about illness and how much that purifies people and how much that is like a way, a means by which people become sanctified. So for me, who am healthy right now, my stage of life, I am asked, things are expected of me different than for someone else who doesn't have that same level of health, right? And so the whole thing about the Christian life that's so like ironic is like, it's all about, I don't know if it's ironic, but like, it's all about our own free will. And so it's like, it's fully up to us whether or not we become holy. Like it isn't about our circumstances because God has arranged our circumstances. So we have sometimes one plan. This is what my life is going to unfold like. I've chosen this kind of life and this is how it's going to be. And by this means, I'm going to become holy. And then things just completely change. And now this is my actual life. This is what I have now, whatever my thoughts were about how things were going to be. So now this is the path in which I have to try to become holy. So we trust fully in the providence of God that whatever the circumstances of our life are, they're the best circumstances for the salvation of our souls. So we just have to do what's necessary for us to be saved. And that means prioritizing our spiritual life, prioritizing making sure we go to church every single Sunday, every single feast day, all of the 12 great feasts. Like this has to be top priority. Nothing should supplant that. That is top priority. That's bare minimum, And then as we go from there, things can be added in. But there's always a possibility, like especially in our age where we have so many resources, so many books, so many services that are recorded. Like there should be no excuse for us not to be able to completely encompass our life with the life in the church, whatever the circumstances are, especially because it's all dependent on our own disposition. So it's the whole reason why the gulags, the Romanian gulags, these people living in horrible situations became massively holy. They could no longer do their prayer groups. They couldn't do it in the beginning. Some of them at the prison, I think it was Ayud, they had that they lived like a philocalic life. They confessed to each other. They did the best they could. They did prayers together. And then gradually the prison system became so horrific they could no longer do that. And yet they became so holy. Why? Because it was all about the disposition of their heart. It wasn't about the externals. They couldn't go to church on Sunday, St. Jacobus Saligis, he was in the military. He had his days off around Pascha, would have been like Holy Week, Pascha. He chose to give it up for a layman. He was a layman as well at the time. He wasn't a monk. This is before he was a monk. Gave it up for another man so he could spend time with his fiance. And as he's like standing guard and sees the churches, he can see them start to light up and he knows, okay, they're starting to sing Christ is risen. He experienced the uncreated light. He was a lay person in the world, in the military. What was the situation? He had sacrificed. He made a sacrifice for someone else to get to go and celebrate Pascha with their family. He sacrificed that. And so like that, but he did it out of love for Christ. He didn't do it to not go to church. Nothing would have pleased him more to go to church, but for the sake of the person, he sacrificed it. And that is available to all of us. There's no situation where loving God and loving our neighbor isn't available to us. And that's the purpose of our marriage. So I mean, sorry, I'm going on for a long time, but like as I approach my 20th anniversary of when I married my husband, and I feel now, okay, 20 years, I can advise someone, I can give you advice. Maybe I couldn't before because I was still too young. Number one priority needs to be find someone who loves Christ more than you. Find someone who loves Christ more than you, because that's who you want as your co-struggler, who's going to push you to love Christ more than you do. And then that you will help each other throughout your whole life. So don't just look for a soulmate, look for a co-struggler.
Mm-hmm.
That's what married life has been given to us, so that we have a companion as we journey toward this difficult path, that has so many thorns and thistles, that we would have someone who already prioritizes Christ.
Yeah, because if you're both standing side by side, both putting Christ before the other person, your love for them, your love for Christ first, everything in your marriage will be properly ordered. And whenever that order is disordered, whenever it's messed with, if you love your children more than your husband, or your husband more than God, like this is where problems in your family life come from. I totally agree. Pick someone who loves God, who more than you, who, you can be a co-struggler, who can help you on your path, right? That's exactly what you're saying. You're co-strugglers, you're helping each other. And I think too, we should probably say like this is all about the interior intentions, right? Because there's times where maybe, I've had people ask me like, well, my husband, maybe he's not going to church for some reason, and I feel like being a good wife maybe is staying home with him. And it's like, I say I'm not your spiritual father, but my opinion is go to church, but maybe make him like an awesome breakfast before you go. And you're loving, you don't judge him, you don't criticize, right? You're like, I hope you have a great morning, hon. Here's something for breakfast. I'm going to be home as soon as I can, right? And be available for you. But that's the way that you prioritize Christ.
Yeah.
Just to let your husband know you love him and you care for him and you pray for him and all these things, right? So it's, but if your husband's in the hospital, maybe you do stay in the hospital with him, right? Like, so it's particular to your situation, but we're talking about the interior um, direction, of your soul, right? What are you prioritizing? What are you trying to love, right? Because if your love for your husband or your children is not based on Christ's love, then it's idol. It comes down to looking at them as an idol. What can they give me? What do they, say about me?
Yeah.
Right? It's a very selfish love, right? So if you truly want to love your husband, if you truly want to love your children, you have to love Christ first, and these things have to be properly ordered.
Yeah. And that makes you a good mother and a good wife and all of those things. Because when we live with when we love with a possessive love, it causes problems.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have that, and we have to fight against it, It'll only cause problems. Whereas when we love, like exactly what you said, when you love with Christ's love, then people actually feel loved, like they feel genuinely loved, and they don't feel it like a little bit of a twisted,
Manipulative or something.
Yeah,
Because it
exactly.
is a real love.
Selfish or any of
Because
those
Christ
things.
gives us all this freedom, right? If you want to be my disciples, if you want to follow me, right? It's not
Yeah.
like you guys have to follow me. Christ never says that. So what do you want?
Yeah.
And we
And
have to
that's,
allow that in our relationships.
yeah. And that's the same as the monastic life. Like Christ says to the rich young man, if you want to be perfect, go and sell what you have and come and follow me. And he's talking about monasticism. And there's a really cool story in the Abbess Thesia if people are looking for good books to read about monasticism, she writes this book, Letters to a Beginner Nun. It's like to a young nun. And she also writes her autobiography. And in it, she's an incredible person. She was the spiritual daughter of St. John of Kronstadt. And she had more than a photographic memory. I forget what they call it, endemic or something, where it's like you can remember everything. And she knew the gospel by heart, like the verses, every single thing. And she was at school, boarding school, and the principal, or whatever she was, had asked the Metropolitan to come. And she introduced the young student, Thesia, to the Metropolitan. And he asked her to read certain passages from the gospel, not to read, to recite them. She recited them, and he asked her about this passage, and she recited it. And he said, Well, okay, but if Christ says that, then if everyone gives away their money to the poor, then the poor become rich and the rich become poor. So what, how would that work? Because he's kind of testing her. And she explains, no, he's speaking to monastics. Not everyone will do it, but for those who wish to become perfect, this is what they'll do. And Christ says it again when he says, and this is all in Matthew's gospel, for the, there are eunuchs who are born eunuchs. There are eunuchs who are made eunuchs. And then there are eunuchs who make themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let those who have room find room. And so, I know, like I was saying earlier, I know people who lived married lives. I know like a nun that I knew personally, her and her husband couldn't have children. They lived in the world for a long time. But he more and more had this desire to become a monk. So she also agreed, and they became monastics. They made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Other people, when their spouse has died, they might become a monastic. There's all sorts of different things, but the point just being that it's fully freely you choose it or you don't choose it. It isn't for everyone, but for those who have made room for it. And that everything in our whole life needs to be like that. Like, we will become holy because we wanted to become holy. Because God wants everyone to be holy. He is there to sanctify, to purify, to illumine everyone. It doesn't matter the kinds of sins you've committed. It doesn't matter the kinds of horrific things you might have suffered in your life. It doesn't matter what people have done to you. None of that makes you any more or unworthy of God's love. We are all equally unworthy of God's love, but he still loves us, and he still desires to come and make his abode in us. All of us, every single one. So at the end of the day, when we go to the judgment, if we're not saints, it's not going to be because we weren't special chosen, like the way that I remember thinking that as a Roman Catholic, it's like they're specially chosen people. No, it is for everyone, for everyone. So in as much as we desire holiness, God will give us holiness. I mean, not just desire, though. It has to be manifested, obviously, in actions and in words and in the way, our manner of life and all of those things. But in that way, it's actually so amazing, because it's like, yeah, it might ruffle my feathers that monastics are a higher level than the married folk, but at the same time, it's up to me whether or not I become holy. It isn't up to anybody else. And I'm not relegated to this level of holiness if I seek something higher. We always can seek something higher. We just don't want to be in a position where we seek something lower, and we want to really be mindful of that and to be aware of that. God has given me, a spouse. Okay, well, I happen to have a spouse who loves Christ. I want to maintain that. I don't want it to fall back into just like a romantic, foolish rom-com type of thing. No, we want to take what was already good and even make it better, and that's what we're always seeking in our life, whatever our circumstances are, to make it better, to offer to God the best.
Yeah, this is beautiful. Let's end maybe with this really lovely quote with Metropolitan Athanasius, who's talking about the difference. He's talking to young people about choosing marriage or monasticism, because this is a big question people have. And he says, monasticism is not for everyone. We should not all follow the same external path. The point is that we should reject sin, our passions, and love Christ most of all. Whether we decide to become monastics or get married is a matter of our free preference. It is we who choose. But regardless of whether we become monks or nuns, get married, remain celibate, or serve as missionaries in Africa, we must love Christ above all. This is what the gospel says. This is what Christ wants to say. That we must love him above all else, and everything else is up to us. I repeat, if in the gospel, Christ does not point us to an external way of life, marriage or monasticism. He points us to the real way of life in Christ, to love Christ above all and abandon everything else for the love of him, regardless of whether we are married or monastics. This is the meaning of the gospel. Yeah. I love that quote. Yeah. We'll put all these links for things we mentioned down below. But any final thoughts, Matejka?
I think, just to really say about in terms of discerning monasticism or married life. I had another friend who, when a nun said to her, "What do you think you want to do? You want to get married? You want to be a monastic?" And she said, "Oh, I'm not really sure. I sometimes I think I want to be married. Sometimes I think I want to be a monastic." And the nun said to her, "Get married, because this life is too difficult for you to have any doubt. And if you are called to monasticism, you will know you are called to monasticism, because it is hard. It is hard, and it isn't for everybody. And it might not be. And we're not talking about. There's a Greek term theusa. It's like goody two shoes, I guess we would say in English. Theusa, like it isn't just theusas, just people who seem goody goody. No, I know of a nun who smoked a pack of cigarettes right up into the day she literally stepped foot on the monastery to become a nun.
Yeah.
And so it's different characters. You can't anticipate, but there's a way that you can find out, try it out, go to different monasteries, but always keeping in mind that exact thing that the Metropolitan was talking about is like the salvation of the soul. I know a young man who was very interested in monasticism, and for like 2 or more years traveled around to different monasteries, all in North America, in Europe, Mount Athos, multiple times, multiple trips to these different monasteries. And his whole hang up was he, wanted to become a monk, but just couldn't decide where. So this is the other thing, is that people have different things, right, about discerning. And he had gone to an elder on the Holy Mountain, and in one of his previous trips, and he went to him again in one of his last trips, and the elder had said to him, like, "My child, you're still you're still occupied with what place and what elder that you're going to serve, like that you're going to be a monk under." And he said, "You had the thought to become a monk, and that's a good thought. But the supreme thought is to seek the salvation of your soul." And that actually solved this dilemma for this young man. And then he had peace and could pray and discern where was the best place for him to save his soul. And then he was able to choose the monastery to reside in. So it's the same thing for us, whether it's married life, whether it's monasticism, those are good. Both of them are good things. But the supreme thing is the salvation of our soul. So if I am called to monasticism, that is where my soul can be saved. It's in monasticism. If I'm called to the married life, that is where my soul can be saved. So that's the ultimate, that's the supreme, that's the end all be all, is we're seeking the salvation of our souls. If we can become monastics, that is the 100-fold. That's what Amos Key said. That is the teaching of the church. It is the highest kind of life, the angelic life. That's why it's called angelic life. If we can't, it's okay, because salvation is still for us. So that's what we have to always remember, is we do what we're called to, but we do it fully, with our full heart, with our whole dedication for the salvation of our souls, that Christ would come and dwell in us and make an abode in us, whatever the circumstances are that we live in.
Right. Anyone can be saved in the circumstances that they're in. Yeah.
Exactly. So, and anyone can become a saint. Can become. Of course, it's a potentiality, but can be.
Right. Well, thank you, Matushka. It's lovely to see you again in chat. Do you want to tell us about your new books, or you have several books?
Yeah, I'll just maybe briefly mention the Sin of Holiness, which is probably more relevant for this topic, the Lessons from a Women's Monastery at Ancient Faith Publishing, and the Sweetness of Grace, which is also some stories with monastics, but also just more generally experiences in South Korea, where we lived for a year, and there's an Orthodox church, and they've had orthodoxy for over 100 years, and a bit about North America. And then the most recent, Upon This Rock, which is reflections of being a priest's wife. Now we've lived here now officially 12 years. So on the 10th anniversary of the day that we moved to Newfoundland, the iconostasis at our church was built. On the 12th anniversary of the day that we moved to Newfoundland, the iconostasis in our house chapel was finished, and we were able to put my hand-painted icons up. So we've had a house chapel, but we've never had an iconostasis in our house chapel. So that was kind of
people can see pictures over on Instagram if they follow you.
Yes, yeah. Our little chapel is Saint Nectarius. Yeah,
it's beautiful. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you, Matushka. You want to end with our prayer?
Sure. Through the prayers of our Holy Fathers, O Lord Jesus Christ, our God, have mercy on us and save us. Amen.
Amen.